Night had draped itself over the small town, folding every cobblestone street and shuttered window in a blanket of calm darkness. The sky, a deep indigo streaked with pale silver clouds, hung quietly above, as if holding its breath in anticipation of something yet to come. A soft wind whispered through the narrow lanes, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a subtle reminder of lives tucked away behind closed doors. In the midst of this serene quiet, the ordinary tavern stood like a solitary beacon, its warm, amber light spilling onto the street in gentle arcs, promising respite and human connection. Inside, the tavern breathed a different kind of life. The low hum of conversation mixed with the occasional clink of mugs, punctuated by the soft crackle of the hearth. Shadows danced on the timbered walls, cast by the flickering flames, giving the room a sense of both comfort and secretive intimacy. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of aged oak, roasted meat, and the subtle tang of ale. Every object seemed alive in its own right: the worn bar counter, the scratches on the tables, the slightly warped floorboards, bearing witness to countless gatherings, countless stories whispered in passing. Patrons filled the space in quiet clusters. A man with calloused hands leaned against the bar, nursing a mug of ale, his gaze distant yet alert. At a corner table, a pair of students huddled over a book, whispering conspiratorially, their heads bending close as if to protect the fragile spark of thought that might ignite between them. A few sailors, tired from the day's labor at the docks, spoke in low tones, recounting tales of distant shores and strange, forgotten lands. Their voices, though subdued, carried the weight of experience, as if each word could anchor a memory that might otherwise drift away with the tide. Though the scene was calm, there was a subtle undercurrent that hinted at something more. An almost imperceptible tension threaded through the laughter and murmured conversation. The innkeeper moved between tables with practiced ease, his eyes constantly scanning, noting who lingered, who arrived, who left. His hands, strong and weathered, poured drinks with a precision born of years of routine, but his mind was elsewhere, sensing the invisible threads of anticipation in the room. There was a feeling that, beneath the surface of ordinary life, something remarkable was poised to unfold, if only someone could recognize it. Time itself seemed to bend slightly in the tavern. Moments lingered, stretched by the warmth of the fire and the steady cadence of human voices. Each mug raised, each gesture, each glance carried with it an intimacy that the outside world could not perceive. There was a rhythm here, slow and deliberate, inviting reflection. A listener might feel as though the very walls were leaning in, ready to confide in anyone patient enough to hear their secrets. It was the kind of space where ideas, even the smallest ones, could take root quietly and grow without notice, nourished by curiosity, conversation, and the shared presence of those who dared to dream. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the subtle motions within the tavern. The world beyond these walls moved according to routines and expectations, guided by rules and authority. Yet here, within the glow of lanterns and the embrace of timber and stone, time seemed to slow, allowing ordinary people to become extraordinary simply through the act of being together. Every sigh, every chuckle, every pause in speech carried weight, as if destiny itself had chosen this place as the vessel for something yet unseen. The air occasionally shifted with the door opening, letting in a rush of cold night air that danced across the hearth's warmth, reminding those inside of the boundary between safety and the unknown. Patrons welcomed the change, briefly acknowledging the contrast, then returning to the intimate cocoon of the tavern. In these fleeting moments, one could sense that change, subtle yet inexorable, was already at work. Ideas, like sparks from the hearth, leapt quietly from one mind to another, unnoticed by those untrained to recognize their significance. Even the ordinary sounds seemed to hold meaning: the scrape of a chair, the gentle thud of a booted foot on wooden floor, the soft murmur of conversation that might have appeared trivial to an outsider. To those within, however, these sounds became punctuation in a living narrative, signals in a story that was unfolding slowly, deliberately. It was in these small, unassuming details that the tavern's true power resided, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right minds to piece together the threads of discontent, hope, and imagination. Somewhere in a dim corner, a young scholar traced her finger across the surface of a book, the candlelight illuminating a face etched with quiet determination. Across the room, a burly worker leaned forward, his voice low and steady, sharing an observation that might seem trivial to the casual listener, yet carried the potential to alter perception. The innkeeper, ever watchful, caught glimpses of these interactions, noting the sparks that leapt between minds, aware that history itself could begin quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the ordinary movements and whispered words of ordinary people. It was, in every sense, a place of contrast. Inside, warmth and human connection. Outside, stillness and solitude. Inside, conversation and subtle excitement. Outside, routine and the weight of expectation. Inside, the ordinary. Outside, the ordinary as well, but ready to be transformed by forces that would emerge from this very room. One could not yet see the revolution that lay ahead, but within the walls of the tavern, the first breaths of change were already stirring, gentle and almost ethereal, waiting to grow into something monumental. By the time the night reached its deepest hour, the tavern had settled into a soft rhythm, like a living organism breathing slowly and deliberately. The flickering fire cast long shadows, the air hummed with quiet energy, and every patron felt, perhaps without realizing it, that they were on the edge of something extraordinary. Sleep might have tempted some, and yet even in rest, the ideas circulating in the room planted seeds in minds, seeds that would one day bloom into action. The ordinary had become the cradle of the extraordinary, and the night, in its infinite patience, held all possibilities in gentle suspense. In that moment, the tavern was no longer just a building of timber and stone. It had become a stage for destiny, a quiet witness to the birth of thought that might one day shape the world. The soft murmurs of patrons, the warmth of the fire, the faint scent of wood and ale, all of it combined into a symphony of potential. And as the town outside slept, unaware, the tavern whispered its promise to those within, that ordinary places, touched by extraordinary minds, could indeed spark revolutions, not in a roar, but in a quiet, deliberate, almost imperceptible beginning that history would one day remember. The tavern, from the outside, appeared ordinary to any passerby. Its wooden sign swung gently in the evening breeze, announcing its presence with faded lettering that had endured countless seasons of sun, rain, and wind. From the narrow cobblestone street, one could hear only a faint murmur of voices and the occasional metallic clatter of mugs meeting the bar. There was nothing extraordinary at first glance, no grandeur of architecture, no majestic gates, no opulent decoration. Yet within, the tavern held a quiet significance that could not be perceived by an outsider, a warmth and vibrancy born from the lives and stories of those who entered its doors. Stepping inside was like crossing a threshold into a different rhythm of existence. The dim glow of lanterns lined the walls, casting gentle pools of light over the rough wooden tables. Each table bore the marks of countless gatherings, deep scratches from hurriedly scribbled notes, the faint discoloration from spilled wine, and the subtle impressions of elbows and knuckles pressed into wood during long discussions. These imperfections, far from diminishing the tavern's charm, gave it a sense of lived history, a quiet testament to the passage of countless days and nights, to the conversations and decisions that had quietly shaped the lives of its patrons. The hearth dominated the center of the room, its flames dancing lazily, sending sparks upwards that seemed to linger momentarily before fading into the chimney's darkness. The firelight played across the walls, illuminating the faces of the patrons with a warmth that was both physical and emotional. Shadows stretched and shifted, forming patterns that seemed almost alive, moving with the people and the moments in the room. The atmosphere was thick with familiarity, a soft embrace that invited each visitor to settle, to linger, to listen and speak without fear of judgment. Patrons arrived and departed in their quiet procession, each adding to the tavern's character in subtle ways. A merchant, weary from the day's trade, sank into a chair, rubbing calloused hands together, eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. His presence carried the quiet authority of experience, of someone who had seen the world beyond the town's borders and returned with stories etched into his very posture. Nearby, a group of young scholars bent over their notebooks, whispering theories and ideas in soft, urgent tones. Their enthusiasm, though contained, was palpable, infusing the air with an undercurrent of intellectual energy. Sailors, too, frequented this ordinary place, bringing with them the scent of salt and sea, the rhythm of distant waves embedded in their gait and speech. They spoke of foreign ports and strange customs, weaving tales that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Yet within the tavern's walls, these stories became part of the familiar tapestry, grounding the exotic in the ordinary. Even the occasional wanderer, drawn by curiosity or necessity, found a place at the table, a warm mug in hand, and the subtle comfort of anonymity amidst the steady hum of conversation. Every detail of the tavern contributed to its understated significance. The bar itself was long and polished by decades of care, its surface warm and inviting to the touch. Shelves behind it carried bottles of every imaginable size and color, their labels fading with age, each containing spirits distilled with care and memory. The air smelled faintly of oak and hops, mingled with the occasional sweetness of roasted bread or simmering stew. These ordinary details, unnoticed by most, created a rich sensory tapestry that made the tavern more than a place to drink. It became a place where stories were born, shared, and preserved. The patrons themselves were as ordinary as the tavern, yet each carried within them the seeds of extraordinary thought. A young man, perhaps a poet in another life, traced circles on the tabletop with his fingertip, lost in quiet reflection. An elderly woman, who had witnessed decades of change in the town, sipped her tea slowly, her eyes scanning the room as though cataloguing every gesture, every exchange, every subtle nuance. Even the innkeeper, moving with practiced ease, understood that each individual contributed to a larger rhythm, one that, though imperceptible in the moment, would ripple outward beyond the tavern's walls. Conversation flowed in gentle currents, ebbing and rising without force or urgency. A merchant might comment on a new shipment of goods, only to be gently interrupted by a student questioning the fairness of local taxes. Laughter mingled with quiet agreement and occasional disagreement, creating a mosaic of human expression that seemed almost sacred in its ordinariness. Every interaction carried weight, subtle yet significant, each exchange a small brushstroke in a larger narrative that no one present could yet fully perceive. The ordinary nature of the tavern was its true power. Here, the extraordinary could emerge without notice. The unassuming architecture and familiar furnishings allowed ideas to take root in minds that might otherwise remain dormant. The rhythm of everyday life, the clinking of mugs, the soft murmur of voices, the crackle of the hearth, served as a backdrop against which revolutionary thought could gestate. In this quiet, unremarkable space, minds were free to wander, to question, and to imagine possibilities that extended far beyond the town's borders. It was in small gestures, almost imperceptible, that the tavern revealed its role as a crucible for change. A glance shared between two patrons, a hushed word exchanged in a corner, a thoughtful pause before responding to a question, all of these became part of an invisible network of understanding. Each participant, whether aware or not, contributed to a growing sense of purpose. The tavern, ordinary though it appeared, functioned as a living organism, each person a vital component in its subtle yet powerful heartbeat. Even the rhythms of daily life reinforced the tavern's quiet influence. The arrival of the first patrons at dusk marked the beginning of a shared ritual, the lighting of candles and lanterns signaling a transition from the world outside into a space where ordinary concerns could transform into meaningful discourse. The clatter of mugs and the soft creak of floorboards accompanied the rhythm of conversation, lending cadence to ideas as they were formed, tested, and shared. Time, in this space, seemed to expand, allowing the ordinary to reveal its extraordinary potential. As the evening deepened, the tavern seemed to settle into a reflective hush. Patrons leaned closer in conversation, their voices dropping to softer tones, as if recognizing that the night itself demanded attentiveness. The warmth of the hearth enveloped the room, and the subtle aroma of roasted food and ale carried a comforting, almost hypnotic quality. Every small sound, the scraping of a chair, the soft sigh of contentment, the distant laughter, added texture to the tapestry of ordinary life that had, without fanfare, become a vessel for extraordinary possibility. It was here, amid the worn tables, flickering lanterns, and steady heartbeat of human presence, that the seeds of change found fertile ground. The tavern, though seemingly ordinary, was a gathering place for minds that dared to question, to imagine, and to dream. And though no one within its walls yet realized the scope of what might arise, the space itself held a quiet promise, that ordinary places, when filled with extraordinary thought, could become the birthplace of events that would echo far beyond their walls, shaping history in ways invisible to those still walking the cobblestone streets outside. by the time the night reached its midpoint, a profound sense of calm had settled over the tavern. Patrons were no longer merely individuals occupying space, they had become part of a living rhythm, a slow, deliberate pulse of thought and conversation. The ordinary surroundings, the walls, the floor, the hearth, the worn tables, were elevated by the minds they held within, becoming a quiet stage for ideas yet to manifest. And so, the tavern remained, unassuming and steadfast, ready to nurture the extraordinary from the most ordinary of places, as the night continued to stretch endlessly, promising that within its warm glow, the beginnings of history were already quietly unfolding. Beyond the tavern's warm glow, the town itself bore the quiet marks of unease. Streets that might once have echoed with cheerful footsteps now carried a subdued cadence, as if the people were walking on invisible tension. Windows were shuttered tightly in some houses, doors bolted, not always against thieves, but against the uncertainty that hung in the air like a persistent mist. Whispers traveled faster than the wind, moving through markets, workshops, and quiet courtyards. Rumors of new taxes, unfair laws, and corrupt officials traveled from ear to ear, carried in cautious voices that betrayed both fear and indignation. The townsfolk were a mixture of resignation and quiet frustration. Farmers, who rose before dawn and labored long into the fading light, spoke bitterly of levies that seemed impossible to bear. They shared tales of crops seized for debts they could not repay, of landlords whose eyes were sharp with greed, yet blind to human suffering. Merchants complained of tolls that drained profits and regulations that favored the wealthy few over the many. Even children sensed it in the clipped tones of their parents, in the furrowed brows of those who once smiled freely. The atmosphere was one of subtle rebellion simmering under the surface, though no one dared yet to name it openly. In the tavern, these grievances did not remain abstract. Patrons brought the weight of the outside world with them, layering it over the room's familiar warmth. Each conversation carried a subtle intensity, as if ordinary words were vessels for unspoken frustration. A dockworker might recount how taxes had stripped away his savings, while the innkeeper nodded in quiet understanding, pouring ale and listening as the stories of hardship and injustice wove themselves into the fabric of the night. The tavern became both a refuge and a mirror, reflecting the struggles of the townspeople while quietly nurturing the seeds of thought that could turn frustration into action. Even seemingly mundane complaints carried the spark of potential change. When a merchant remarked on a new decree that favored distant elites over local traders, a young scholar's eyes would narrow, the flicker of awareness passing through them almost imperceptibly. When a sailor described the unfair treatment of workers at the docks, another patron might lean forward, connecting the story to a larger pattern, seeing the invisible chains that bound the town together. Each anecdote, each expression of discontent, contributed to an invisible map of grievances that slowly crystallized into something more significant, a collective awareness that the world need not always remain as it was. The contrast between daily life and the injustices endured outside the tavern could not have been more pronounced. Outside, there was the routine rhythm of labor and domestic life, steady and predictable. Inside, however, ordinary moments of conversation took on new weight, becoming charged with insight, understanding, and subtle defiance. The tavern, in this way, became a quiet incubator for awareness. It allowed the ordinary to be reconsidered, reinterpreted, and, eventually, challenged. Within its walls, ideas that might have remained private could be shared, tested, and expanded upon in the soft safety of attentive listeners. Rumors of injustice were often cloaked in humor or sarcasm, softening their delivery but not their impact. Patrons laughed quietly at the absurdity of bureaucratic decisions, at the contradictions in decrees handed down from distant authorities, at the cruel irony of being taxed for goods already meagerly earned. Yet beneath this humor was a current of anger, slow and deliberate, like water carving grooves in stone. The laughter allowed people to voice dissatisfaction without immediate consequence, but it also reinforced the collective awareness that their reality was flawed, that the structures around them were neither permanent nor unchangeable. The tavern's own rhythm seemed to respond to these subtle energies. The hearth burned a little brighter, the murmur of voices carried a hint more urgency, and the air seemed dense with possibility. Even the innkeeper, who had seen countless nights pass without incident, sensed the growing tension, the quiet gestation of ideas that might one day reshape the lives of those present. He moved with a careful balance of attentiveness and discretion, offering the warmth of hospitality while observing the delicate interplay of minds and opinions around him. In corners, quiet conversations hinted at broader reflections. A young artisan might comment on the disparity between wealth and labor, prompting nods from those who understood the unfairness but had lacked words for it. A retired soldier, remembering times of hardship and sacrifice, might speak of leadership that had betrayed the people's trust. Each small insight became part of a shared consciousness, a tapestry of grievances that slowly began to outline the contours of systemic injustice. This was no hurried plotting, no loud declarations, it was the slow, deliberate alignment of thought, a mental preparation for the possibilities that might one day emerge. Even the ordinary sounds of the tavern contributed to the atmosphere of subtle unrest. The scrape of a chair, the gentle thud of a boot on the floor, the low murmur of conversation, all acted as punctuation in the dialogue of ideas forming within the room. Patrons absorbed and reflected on these sounds, often unconsciously, letting them guide the rhythm of discussion, the pace of reflection, and the ebb and flow of shared awareness. In this ordinary environment, extraordinary seeds could be planted, taking root in the fertile minds of those willing to notice them. The night itself seemed to join in the process. Shadows lengthened and merged, as if emphasizing the hidden tensions lying beneath the surface. The firelight flickered with irregularity, echoing the irregularity of fortune and justice beyond the tavern walls. A soft wind whispered against the windows, carrying with it the sense of movement, change, and the unseen forces at work in the world outside. Patrons, though focused on their immediate conversations, felt the subtle presence of these larger currents, their minds stretching just slightly beyond the room, sensing that what seemed ordinary could, in time, become extraordinary. Even the youngest observers absorbed this energy. Children who occasionally peeked into the tavern or sat quietly with a parent learned, unknowingly, that the world was not always fair, that voices and ideas mattered, and that even small actions could ripple outward. The tavern, ordinary in appearance, served as a silent teacher, conveying lessons not through instruction but through presence, dialogue, and shared human experience. The seeds of discontent, planted gently and carefully, would one day blossom into the resolve necessary for greater change. By the end of the evening, the sense of tension, subtle though it was, had become almost tangible. Patrons rose from tables, murmured goodbyes, and stepped back into the night, carrying with them the thoughts and reflections they had absorbed. The town outside remained unaware of the invisible transformations that had occurred within the tavern's walls. Each mind left richer, more aware, more attuned to the injustices that lay waiting to be challenged. The ordinary tavern, in its quiet persistence, had become the cradle for awakening, the place where discontent first began to gather the quiet momentum of something far greater than itself. And so, as the tavern doors closed behind the last patrons, the fire's glow lingered on the worn floorboards, the shadows continued their slow dance, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Within those walls, the seeds of discontent had taken root, small, almost imperceptible, yet potent with promise. The ordinary had begun to touch the extraordinary, and in the silent reflection of the night, one could almost sense that the story of a revolution had already begun its slow, deliberate unfolding. Within the tavern, amidst the flickering candlelight and the soft murmur of conversation, certain figures stood out, not because of flamboyance or grandeur, but because of the quiet intensity they carried in their presence. These were the patrons whose thoughts, words, and gestures hinted at a depth that others might not immediately perceive. Their lives, experiences, and subtle interactions created the rich tapestry that gave the tavern its extraordinary essence. They were ordinary individuals, yet each contained the spark of insight or courage capable of kindling ideas far beyond the walls of the room. The innkeeper, a man whose age was difficult to pinpoint, moved with the steady assurance of someone who had seen decades pass behind his bar. His hands were strong, calloused, and precise, yet his movements were unhurried, measured with care and thought. He possessed an almost imperceptible air of authority, not imposed, but earned, a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Patrons instinctively gravitated toward him, seeking not only refreshment but a quiet anchor amid the shifting currents of conversation. He listened more than he spoke, yet his eyes, sharp and observant, recorded every nuance, the nervous glance, the subtle sigh, the flicker of curiosity that passed across a young scholar's face. The young scholar, barely more than a boy in years but ancient in the intensity of thought, often sat in a shadowed corner, hunched over a small, worn notebook. His fingers traced lines of text with deliberate care, pausing frequently as ideas formed and then dissolved, leaving only traces of questions yet unanswered. His presence was almost ethereal, a quiet energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the firelight. He was curious in a way that was both unsettling and invigorating to those around him. His questions lingered, often leaving the person addressed with a subtle unease, as if realizing they had not yet examined their own thoughts as carefully as they might. Nearby, a disillusioned soldier frequented the tavern, his uniform faded, boots scuffed, and eyes heavy with memories of battles both won and lost. He spoke sparingly, but when he did, his words carried weight, tinged with experience and insight that only hardship could bring. His presence introduced a quiet gravity into conversations, a reminder that the world outside was harsher than the tavern's warmth could contain. Patrons often leaned in subtly when he spoke, sensing that each anecdote, each reflection on loyalty, courage, and sacrifice, was more than a story, it was a lesson tempered by life itself. Among the more regular visitors was a merchant, shrewd yet approachable, whose life had been spent navigating the precarious balance between commerce and survival. He spoke often of trade, taxes, and the intricacies of town governance, but there was an underlying current in his speech, a recognition that the rules governing his trade were not always just. He served as a bridge between the everyday struggles of ordinary citizens and the broader awareness of systemic inequality. Through his anecdotes, the tavern's patrons glimpsed the larger structures that shaped their lives, connecting their personal frustrations to a shared understanding of a world in need of reconsideration. Even more subtle, yet equally vital, was the presence of those who might have appeared insignificant at first glance. The elderly woman, quietly observing from her seat near the hearth, carried a depth of memory and wisdom. Her eyes, soft but penetrating, scanned the room with an almost imperceptible understanding of human nature. She rarely spoke unless prompted, yet when she did, her words were precise, measured, and imbued with a quiet authority. Her stories were not loud tales of heroism, but gentle reminders of human resilience, of the ways ordinary choices ripple outward across time, influencing those who come after. Each character interacted in ways that were often understated, yet the interplay of their personalities created subtle tension, intellectual energy, and emotional resonance. The innkeeper's calm observation balanced the scholar's restless curiosity. The soldier's grave reflections provided context to the merchant's practical considerations. The elderly woman's quiet wisdom threaded through every discussion, grounding abstract ideas in lived experience. Together, they formed a microcosm of society, representing the spectrum of thought, concern, and ambition that existed beyond the tavern's walls, yet found a rare concentration within its humble confines. It was in the ordinary gestures that their extraordinary qualities became evident. The scholar might brush a stray lock of hair from his eyes before asking a pointed question that lingered in the air. The soldier could pause mid-sentence, tapping the rim of his mug as if weighing each word before releasing it. The merchant adjusted his coat, leaning slightly forward, signaling readiness to engage but also caution. These minute expressions, too small for the inattentive eye, spoke volumes to those who watched closely. In the tavern, ordinary human behaviors were magnified into instruments of understanding, subtle yet powerful, shaping the flow of thought and the contours of conversation. The connections between these patrons were often invisible to outsiders, yet palpable to those attuned to the room's rhythms. A glance exchanged across a table could carry the weight of shared recognition. A nod might confirm understanding, while a slight frown suggested a challenge to be considered. Ideas passed through gestures, through silences, and through the cadence of speech, forming a network that was at once fragile and enduring. Within this network, a single observation, carefully placed, could ripple outward, sparking reflection and, eventually, action. In quieter moments, the tavern seemed to breathe with these minds. The firelight, the murmur of voices, the soft creak of floorboards, all combined into a gentle symphony of interaction, each note carrying significance. The ordinary tavern, with its worn tables and flickering lanterns, became a theater for human thought, where ordinary men and women assumed extraordinary roles in the quiet cultivation of ideas. Here, they were both themselves and part of something larger, an invisible narrative that, if nurtured carefully, might one day alter the course of their town, their society, and history itself. It was not confrontation, nor flamboyance, that defined their importance, but rather the subtle qualities that encouraged reflection, observation, and dialogue. Courage was present, but often quiet. Intelligence showed itself not in loud proclamations, but in questions, suggestions, and measured insight. Compassion threaded through even the smallest interactions, providing a moral compass in moments when discussions veered toward frustration or cynicism. Each person, ordinary yet extraordinary, contributed to the tavern's unique atmosphere, where ideas could take root and grow without the pressures of the outside world. The evening wore on, and as patrons leaned into conversation, a delicate tension began to emerge. Ideas were not yet fully formed, but the threads were connecting, weaving a fabric of awareness and subtle discontent. The scholar's questions nudged others to reconsider assumptions. The soldier's reflections reminded them of the stakes inherent in human action. The merchant's observations connected personal struggle to broader injustice, while the elderly woman's gentle interjections grounded abstract ideas in lived reality. In this ordinary tavern, minds began to align in ways that would have been imperceptible to any casual observer but were foundational to the extraordinary events yet to come. Even the patrons who spoke little contributed to this unseen momentum. A quiet student might simply observe, absorbing information and reflecting silently, their mind quietly forming connections that would emerge at a later, critical moment. A newcomer, stepping in out of curiosity, might unknowingly introduce a perspective that reshaped ongoing discussions. Each person, whether active or passive in dialogue, became part of an invisible choreography, their actions and reactions shaping the atmosphere in subtle, yet profound, ways. By the end of the evening, the tavern had become a space of latent potential. The patrons were ordinary, their appearances unremarkable, yet within their conversations and interactions, the beginnings of insight, understanding, and shared purpose had begun to take root. The tavern, simple and unadorned, was transformed into a quiet crucible for thought, where the ordinary human spirit encountered extraordinary possibility. And as the last patrons lingered near the fire, sipping their drinks and exchanging quiet observations, one could almost sense that these characters, through their very existence and interactions, were preparing to touch the world beyond the tavern in ways that would echo long into the future. It was an evening like many others, the tavern bathed in its familiar glow, the firelight casting long, wavering shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. Patrons had settled into their usual rhythm, their conversations blending into a gentle hum that filled the room. Yet on this particular night, something subtle, almost imperceptible, began to shift, a spark, delicate and quiet, moving through the air like a whisper, waiting for the right moment to ignite. It began in the corners, in the spaces between words, in the pregnant pauses of thought, and it would soon grow into an energy that none present could ignore. The innkeeper, polishing a mug with the precision of years, noticed the shift first in the air, then in the movements of his patrons. A student, usually absorbed in writing and theory, paused mid-sentence, his eyes reflecting a sudden clarity. The soldier, resting his arm on the bar, caught a subtle glint in the merchant's gaze, an understanding that passed without words. The elderly woman, quietly knitting in her corner, looked up as if sensing an invisible thread weaving the room together. In this ordinary setting, the extraordinary was beginning its gentle, deliberate emergence. The spark emerged from a conversation that, to an outsider, might have seemed mundane. A comment about the unfair distribution of resources, spoken softly yet with conviction, resonated in ways unintended. The merchant had remarked on the growing divide between those who held wealth and power and those who toiled endlessly without reward. The words were simple, grounded in the daily reality of life, yet they carried with them a weight that began to ripple outward, touching each mind present. The scholar leaned closer, scribbling notes in his book, while the soldier's brow furrowed, recalling experiences that mirrored the injustice being described. Even the innkeeper paused, aware that a subtle alignment of thought had occurred. The conversation deepened, becoming a gentle, slow exploration of the tensions and inequities that had long simmered beneath the surface. Ideas were proposed cautiously, tested through questioning rather than assertion, like small sparks seeking oxygen. Patrons listened intently, the atmosphere charged with a delicate tension that demanded attention yet remained calm, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. Each participant was aware of the significance of their own thoughts, of the words they chose to utter, of the silence they allowed to settle between sentences. The room seemed to expand, not physically, but in presence, as if every mind in attendance was beginning to recognize a shared possibility that had previously existed only in fragments. It was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow awakening, the kind that grows almost imperceptibly until it is undeniable. The student, inspired by the conversation, suggested a minor but meaningful action, something that could be undertaken within the safety of the tavern yet had the potential to resonate beyond it. The soldier, nodding thoughtfully, recalled similar strategies employed in situations of conflict, where patience and careful planning mattered as much as courage. The merchant, ever practical, considered the logistics and implications, weighing risks against the potential for change. Even the elderly woman, whose wisdom often manifested in subtle interjections, offered insight that encouraged both reflection and action. The spark, once ignited, began to feed on the connections between the patrons. Ideas flowed, overlapping and intertwining, each adding fuel to the quiet flame. Questions were posed, gently yet persistently, prompting those present to consider not only what was unjust, but why, and how it might be addressed without chaos or rashness. The energy in the room remained calm and deliberate, yet it was unmistakable, a sense that something was emerging that had not existed before, a collective recognition that the ordinary could indeed be transformed into something extraordinary. Outside, the night continued its slow, steady march, oblivious to the subtle storm within the tavern. The streets were quiet, the town's usual routine uninterrupted, yet inside, a revolution of thought had begun. The patrons, absorbed in discussion, were unaware of how profoundly their ideas had begun to align. They spoke not with anger, but with clarity, not with force, but with purpose. Each observation, each connection, each nod of understanding was a step toward something larger, though the final shape of that something was still undefined. Once the spark had been lit, it did not remain confined to a single conversation. Instead, it began to ripple quietly through the tavern, carried on whispers and subtle gestures, spreading from one patron to another like a gentle, persistent wind. Words, carefully chosen, floated from lips to attentive ears, gaining depth with each repetition. A mention of injustice here, a hint of possibility there, these small threads began to weave together, forming a network of understanding that was invisible to anyone outside the room but increasingly tangible to those within. The power of rumor, when tempered with discretion, was remarkable. Patrons spoke softly, leaning close so that only the intended listener could catch each word. The scholar, notebook in hand, scribbled notes hastily, ensuring that ideas, once spoken, would not be lost to the night. The soldier, whose experiences had taught him the importance of caution, listened intently, nodding at subtle suggestions and filing them carefully in his memory. Even the innkeeper, moving between tables with practiced ease, recognized the significance of the hushed exchanges. He knew that each whisper carried potential far beyond the tavern walls, capable of influencing actions long before the first overt sign of change appeared. The whispers themselves were layered and complex. Some were observations of the town's inequities, the unfair taxation, the privileges of the wealthy, the struggles of those laboring unseen. Others were reflections on broader societal structures, pondered carefully, shared in the soft intimacy that the tavern afforded. A merchant might murmur about the frustrations of trade, and a nearby patron, listening closely, would connect it to the grievances of the dockworkers. A young student might quietly note the limitations imposed by local authorities, and those in earshot would nod in understanding, realizing that their personal struggles were part of a larger pattern. Rumors were not merely idle chatter, they became instruments of connection and awareness. The tavern's patrons, ordinary individuals in most other circumstances, began to see their lives as interconnected, as part of a web of cause and effect that extended beyond their immediate perception. Conversations that might have seemed trivial to an outsider acquired weight, charged with significance, as each listener processed the information and passed it along to the next. The gentle cadence of discussion allowed ideas to take root, without forcing them, giving each person the opportunity to internalize, reflect, and consider next steps. It was in the subtleties that the whispers gained their strength. A quiet nod could signal agreement, a carefully phrased question could provoke thought, and a moment of silence could be more compelling than any declaration. Patrons began to pay attention to nuances they might previously have overlooked: the tone of a voice, the flicker of a glance, the slight pause before a response. Each small signal added depth to the growing network of understanding, creating a dynamic interplay between speech and observation, intention and interpretation. The tavern itself seemed to respond to these murmurs. The firelight flickered more vividly, shadows shifting as if to emphasize particular moments of conversation. The soft clatter of mugs and utensils punctuated the rhythm of discussion, providing a gentle cadence that guided reflection and attention. Even the background sounds, the wind against the windows, the occasional creak of a floorboard, the distant bark of a dog, added layers of subtle context to the unfolding dialogue. The ordinary setting, familiar and comforting, provided the perfect stage for ideas to circulate without the constraints of authority or expectation. The innkeeper, always perceptive, facilitated these whispers in his quiet, unassuming way. He offered a mug of ale here, a plate of bread there, creating opportunities for patrons to linger, to converse, and to exchange ideas. His movements, deliberate yet unobtrusive, provided continuity and stability, allowing the energy in the room to flow naturally. He did not push or direct. Rather, he allowed the currents of thought to find their own paths, confident that the ordinary environment of the tavern, combined with attentive minds, could nurture the beginnings of something significant. Some whispers were more daring than others. A sailor, emboldened by trust in familiar faces, recounted an incident of unfair treatment at the docks, his voice low yet steady. A young scholar responded with a quiet suggestion of possible solutions, carefully framed to encourage discussion rather than provoke alarm. The soldier offered examples from his own experience, emphasizing caution, timing, and strategic consideration. The interplay of ideas, shared in these intimate murmurs, began to form a mental blueprint for potential action, subtle yet deliberate, growing in coherence and intent with each passing exchange. Even the less vocal patrons absorbed the energy of the whispers. A quiet observer might not speak, yet their presence amplified the resonance of the ideas circulating in the room. Their attentive listening, the subtle gestures of acknowledgement, the occasional thoughtful frown, all contributed to the growing sense that something extraordinary was quietly unfolding. Each participant, whether actively contributing or silently reflecting, became part of an invisible network, a living web of connection that allowed the spark to travel further than any individual could carry alone. Rumors and whispers also served to build trust, a critical element for any nascent movement. The subtle sharing of knowledge, the careful exchange of insights, reinforced the bonds between patrons. Each acknowledgement, each empathetic response, strengthened the sense that they were not alone in their awareness, that their individual frustrations and reflections were shared by others. In this way, the tavern became more than a physical space, it became a crucible of understanding, a sanctuary where ordinary people could explore extraordinary ideas without fear or constraint. Over the course of the night, the whispers began to coalesce into themes. Patrons recognized patterns of injustice, identified shared grievances, and began to contemplate the possibilities for response. The energy in the tavern remained gentle yet persistent, a steady undercurrent that encouraged thought, reflection, and the quiet alignment of intention. Even as individuals arrived and departed, the momentum endured, carried forward in memory, in conversation, and in the subtle acknowledgement of the shared potential for change. By the final hours, the tavern had transformed, subtly but irrevocably. The ordinary murmur of voices had become a slow, deliberate current of shared awareness. The spark ignited in earlier conversation had found fertile ground, nurtured by whispers, observations, and the quiet attention of attentive minds. The patrons, ordinary though they appeared, were now participants in a collective understanding, their thoughts aligned in ways that would prepare them for future decisions, actions, and the eventual unfolding of larger events. And so, as the fire burned low and the last patrons prepared to leave, the whispers lingered in the air, invisible yet tangible. The tavern remained, unassuming and steadfast, a silent witness to the quiet power of connection. Within its walls, rumors had become more than idle chatter, they were the carriers of possibility, the subtle heralds of change. The ordinary had begun to ripple outward, and in the gentle cadence of conversation, the seeds of revolution had been nourished, ready to grow in ways that the night, the town, and even the patrons themselves could scarcely yet imagine. In the quiet aftermath of the evening's whispered conversations, the tavern seemed to hold its breath. The firelight, once bright and flickering with activity, now cast gentle, steady pools of warmth across the tables, illuminating the worn wood and the soft faces of patrons deep in thought. Ideas had been exchanged, observations recorded, and a subtle awareness had taken root. Yet, even as minds reflected on these conversations, a new layer of thought began to emerge: strategy. How might these ideas, fragile and nascent, be nurtured into tangible action without exposing themselves prematurely to the dangers of the outside world? Strategy, in this context, was less about immediate confrontation and more about careful preparation. The scholar, seated near the hearth, traced patterns in his notebook, connecting observations, mapping grievances, and noting potential allies. Each word, each line, was a step in a quiet mental choreography that aimed to align understanding with intention. The soldier, his gaze distant yet attentive, considered timing, risk, and the ways in which human behavior might respond to small nudges. Together, the scholar and soldier represented the fusion of intellect and experience, insight and prudence, theory and practice. The merchant, too, played a vital role in these unspoken strategies. His knowledge of the town's commerce and social networks provided a subtle infrastructure for potential action. He could identify who might be trusted, where influence could be exercised, and which pathways might allow ideas to move undetected through the population. Even in casual remarks, he planted seeds of awareness, observing how others responded, and noting which individuals might later become critical participants. In this quiet, ordinary tavern, the foundation of strategy was being laid, one careful observation at a time. The concept of secrecy was intrinsic to these early stages. The tavern, ordinary though it seemed, offered a rare space where discretion could be maintained without overt vigilance. Patrons learned to communicate in subtle ways. A glance, a nod, a softly spoken phrase carried layered meanings. Each interaction was deliberate, yet natural, ensuring that attention remained on the conversation itself rather than the risk of exposure. The ordinary actions, the pouring of ale, the movement of chairs, the adjustment of lanterns, served as masks, seamlessly blending strategy into the rhythm of nightly life. It was in these subtle exchanges that the true strength of the strategy revealed itself. A young student might pose a question that appeared theoretical but was, in reality, a probing exploration of a problem or weakness. A sailor might casually recount a recent observation at the docks, offering insight into the patterns of movement and authority in the town. The elderly woman, her voice calm and steady, could remark on a detail of history or human behavior that shaped how the group understood timing and patience. Each piece, seemingly small, was a thread woven into a delicate tapestry of preparation, invisible to the untrained eye but rich with potential. Patrons began to internalize the notion that strategy required patience as much as intelligence. Impulse was dangerous. Rash action could dismantle the fragile alignment of understanding that had taken weeks, months, or even years to form. The tavern itself provided a natural rhythm for this patience. The slow cadence of conversation, the gentle flicker of firelight, the comforting repetition of familiar rituals, all reinforced the importance of measured thought and deliberate timing. Even the mundane, the clink of mugs, the scrape of chairs, the soft footfalls across the floor, became instruments in the orchestration of preparation, providing rhythm to the unfolding mental framework. As the night deepened, strategies became more nuanced. Patrons began to discuss possible courses of action, phrased as questions or hypotheticals rather than directives. This careful framing allowed ideas to be tested without commitment, permitting each participant to consider implications, outcomes, and potential risks. The scholar's notebook captured these discussions, translating spoken ideas into written thought, while the soldier silently evaluated each concept for feasibility and consequence. The merchant's observations provided practical checks, grounding abstract possibilities in the realities of daily life. Together, they were forming a quiet blueprint, the outlines of which were invisible to the casual observer but critical to future developments. Secrecy also demanded subtlety in recruitment. Not everyone could be trusted immediately. Discretion required patience, observation, and a keen understanding of character. The innkeeper, with decades of experience, understood this instinctively. He watched interactions with careful attention, noting who demonstrated prudence, loyalty, and insight. Small gestures, a cautious question, a thoughtful response, a measured tone, revealed tendencies that could indicate future reliability. In this ordinary tavern, trust was being cultivated as carefully as any strategy, each decision as deliberate as a brushstroke in a long, evolving painting. Even the environment itself contributed to strategic thinking. The fire's warmth encouraged contemplation, its gentle crackle providing a subtle metronome for the rhythm of reflection. Shadows played across the walls, reminding patrons of the unseen, of possibilities yet to be realized. Lanterns illuminated faces without exposing every detail, lending privacy to even open discussion. The ordinary elements of the tavern, unnoticed by outsiders, became tools in the orchestration of subtle planning, providing the space and context in which minds could align without interference. Small secrets reinforced the collective sense of purpose. Patrons exchanged information in private, yet did so within a framework that emphasized connection rather than isolation. A whispered insight, a discreet question, a softly shared observation, all contributed to the alignment of thought that was beginning to form a coherent strategy. The ordinary tavern had become, almost imperceptibly, a hub of preparation, a place where individual insights merged into collective awareness, and where action, when it eventually came, would be informed, deliberate, and powerful. The process was slow, deliberate, and unhurried, a testament to the understanding that true strategy is cultivated, not imposed. Ideas were refined, reactions observed, and alignment tested. Each patron played a dual role, contributor and observer, offering insight while absorbing the perspectives of others. This balance between speaking and listening created a subtle ecosystem of thought, where ordinary conversation served as the medium for extraordinary preparation. By the time the evening waned, a quiet sense of readiness had taken hold, though no one yet acted overtly. As days turned into nights, the quiet strategies and whispered conversations began to bear fruit. The tavern, once simply a place of warmth and respite, now pulsed with subtle connections forming between patrons. These connections were not announced or proclaimed, they emerged organically, like streams converging in hidden valleys, gradually gaining strength and purpose. Ordinary individuals, brought together by circumstance and shared awareness, began to recognize the value in forming alliances, realizing that unity would amplify their ideas far beyond the reach of solitary effort. The innkeeper observed these emerging alliances with quiet satisfaction. Years of watching human behavior had taught him that trust and collaboration were delicate but potent forces. He provided a neutral space, a stage for these budding partnerships, without drawing attention to them. A casual nod here, a discreet gesture there, allowed patrons to acknowledge mutual understanding without alerting the uninitiated. In the glow of firelight, alliances took root in the simplest ways: a shared glance, a mirrored movement, a silent recognition that together, these individuals could accomplish what none could achieve alone. The scholar, now more confident in his observations and reflections, found natural allies in those whose perspectives complemented his own. The soldier, with his experience in both leadership and caution, offered guidance, ensuring that emerging alliances were grounded in practicality and foresight. The merchant contributed knowledge of the town's networks, identifying individuals whose loyalty and reliability could be counted upon. Each alliance was carefully considered, nurtured through subtle conversations and shared understanding, reinforcing the principle that trust, once cultivated, became a powerful tool for coordinated action. Not all alliances were immediately apparent. Some were formed through indirect observation, through noticing patterns in behavior, or by interpreting the meaning behind carefully phrased remarks. A quiet artisan might align with a local dockworker simply because their concerns intersected, their shared frustrations creating an unspoken bond. A scholar's thoughtful inquiry could spark interest in someone who had previously remained on the sidelines, gently drawing them into the web of shared purpose. These alliances, invisible to casual observers, were already strengthening the foundation of coordinated effort, preparing the town for the subtle emergence of organized action. Alliances were reinforced by mutual respect and the recognition of shared experience. Patrons listened to one another with patience, carefully weighing perspectives before responding. Disagreements, when they arose, were handled with tact, allowing for the reconciliation of differing viewpoints without fracturing the fragile connections being formed. The tavern's environment, warm, safe, and ordinary, allowed these relationships to develop naturally, without the pressures or scrutiny of the outside world. Here, bonds could solidify quietly, ready to serve as the backbone for future collaboration. The formation of alliances also involved subtle tests of reliability and discretion. Patrons learned to observe not only words, but actions, gestures, and consistency of behavior. A promise kept quietly, a thought offered without expectation of reward, a question framed to probe understanding rather than challenge authority, all these small acts served as indicators of trustworthiness. The innkeeper, with his decades of experience, recognized these signs, subtly guiding interactions to ensure that only those capable of maintaining discretion became fully integrated into the emerging network of alliances. These alliances were more than personal connections. They represented the alignment of thought, values, and potential for coordinated action. A quiet conversation about the inequities of local governance could, through the web of alliances, reach multiple patrons, each adding perspective, strategy, and insight. The scholar's observations might inspire practical action from the merchant, while the soldier's experience informed the timing and risk assessment. Even those who contributed minimally still reinforced the network through attentive listening, validating ideas and creating cohesion. In this way, ordinary individuals were transformed into a connected, thoughtful, and resilient community within the walls of the tavern. The process of forming alliances was deliberate and gradual. It relied on subtlety, observation, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Patrons learned the value of patience, recognizing that rushed connections could falter under pressure. Trust was cultivated incrementally, strengthened through repeated interaction, shared insight, and careful assessment. The tavern itself, ordinary in appearance, became a laboratory for social cohesion, where alliances were tested, refined, and solidified without ever drawing attention to their existence. Each alliance brought unique strengths to the collective. Some patrons were skilled in persuasion, able to sway opinions without appearing forceful. Others had knowledge of resources, networks, or social hierarchies, enabling practical strategies to be devised. A few possessed emotional intelligence, understanding when to guide discussions gently or when to allow others to lead. These complementary abilities created a synergy, transforming individual capabilities into a cohesive, flexible force capable of responding thoughtfully to emerging opportunities and challenges. Alliances were also nurtured through shared experiences within the tavern. Moments of humor, quiet reflection, and empathy forged bonds as effectively as deliberate conversation. The simple act of observing one another in a relaxed, safe environment allowed patrons to assess character, build familiarity, and establish rapport. These ordinary experiences became the subtle glue that held alliances together, ensuring that trust was not merely transactional, but deeply rooted in shared human understanding. Even the smallest gestures contributed to the reinforcement of alliances. A hand offered to steady a mug, a chair pulled closer to facilitate conversation, a glance that conveyed understanding without words. All these actions carried significance in the delicate architecture of trust. Patrons internalized the rhythm of these exchanges, learning to communicate not just through words, but through nuanced behavior that strengthened connections while maintaining discretion. The ordinary, when observed closely, revealed its extraordinary capacity to cultivate collaboration. As the night wore on, the alliances coalesced into a web of interdependent relationships, each reinforcing the other, each prepared to support coordinated reflection and, eventually, action. Patrons moved through conversations with heightened awareness, noting who responded with insight, who demonstrated caution, and who maintained discretion. In this way, alliances evolved organically, a living network of trust, understanding, and shared purpose. The tavern, once simply a place for food and drink, had become a crucible of collaboration, its ordinary walls concealing extraordinary social engineering. By the end of the evening, the landscape of the tavern had been transformed. Patrons left with subtle nods, knowing glances, and the quiet satisfaction that their connections had deepened. The spark ignited in earlier conversations had now become a shared current of understanding, amplified and reinforced by the alliances that had formed. Outside, the town remained unaware, its streets silent under the moonlight, yet inside the tavern, an invisible web of relationships had been woven, ready to support the ideas, strategies, and eventual actions that would emerge in the days to come. In this ordinary, seemingly modest tavern, alliances had been forged without spectacle, without announcement, and without force. They were the product of observation, patience, and careful human interaction. Yet their power was undeniable. Within these walls, ordinary individuals had become a network capable of thought, reflection, and subtle coordination, prepared to transform awareness into action. And as the last flicker of firelight danced across the worn tables, one could almost sense that these alliances, quietly formed and patiently nurtured, were the invisible threads that would hold together the unfolding story of change. Even as alliances quietly formed within the tavern, an undercurrent of tension began to take shape, subtle yet persistent, weaving through conversations, glances, and pauses. It was not a tension born of fear, but of awareness, the recognition that ideas, once shared and nurtured, carried consequences beyond the walls of the room. Patrons felt it in the tightening of muscles, the careful choice of words, and the quiet reflection that followed each observation. The ordinary atmosphere of the tavern, warm and familiar, now held a delicate balance between comfort and anticipation, a calm stage upon which invisible forces of thought and intention were quietly at play. The scholar, his notebook open and pen poised, sensed this shift with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Questions that had previously been speculative now felt charged with implication. Every carefully worded comment, every subtle hint, might ripple outward, influencing minds and actions far beyond the tavern. The soldier, sitting nearby, felt a similar tension, the product of experience and foresight. He understood that even the most discreet planning carried risk, and that the alignment of thought within these walls had consequences once it extended into the unpredictable world outside. The tension manifested not only in thought but in physical subtleties. Patrons leaned closer in conversation, lowering voices just enough to remain intimate while ensuring the weight of each idea was felt. Hands rested lightly on tables, tapping occasionally as if to emphasize a point without drawing unnecessary attention. Eyes shifted, darting to measure reactions, to gauge understanding, and to detect hesitation. These movements, almost imperceptible, conveyed volumes. In the ordinary rhythms of the tavern, a new awareness was forming, one that underscored the growing stakes of their quiet deliberations. The merchant, practical and observant, contributed to the sense of tension through his nuanced reflections. He spoke in hypotheticals, framing observations as questions to explore consequences without exposing vulnerability. In doing so, he tested reactions, identified potential risks, and subtly highlighted areas where the alignment of understanding was incomplete. Each conversation became an exercise in foresight, a delicate dance of words and gestures, where the ordinary act of dialogue carried extraordinary significance. The tavern, its familiar corners and flickering lanterns, had become a laboratory for anticipating human behavior, assessing loyalty, and preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. Even small, seemingly insignificant incidents added to the tension. A mug set down a fraction too loudly, a chair shifted unexpectedly, or a quiet cough in a corner could draw attention and spark reflection. Patrons had become attuned to these subtleties, interpreting them within the broader context of strategy and alliance. What might have been overlooked in ordinary circumstances now carried weight, and each individual became increasingly aware of the delicate balance between vigilance and trust. The tavern itself, ordinary and unassuming, had transformed into a space where tension and preparation intertwined seamlessly. Discussions, previously gentle and exploratory, began to carry an added layer of intensity. Ideas were debated with care, tested against the insights and experiences of the group. The scholar proposed theoretical approaches, weighing moral implications and likely outcomes. The soldier evaluated them through the lens of practicality and consequence. The merchant considered logistical feasibility and potential networks of influence. Even those less vocal contributed through subtle reactions, a nod of agreement, a furrowed brow indicating concern, a quiet sigh signaling contemplation. Each response added depth to the collective understanding and increased the sense of tension, as the group recognized the seriousness of their considerations. As alliances deepened, so too did the awareness of vulnerability. The ordinary patrons understood that knowledge, once shared, could be dangerous if misused. Secrets needed protection, and strategies required discretion. This heightened consciousness contributed to the tension, creating a quiet vigilance that permeated the tavern. Eyes were measured, words were chosen with precision, and gestures were deliberate. The atmosphere, though calm on the surface, vibrated with the awareness that even a small misstep could unravel the careful progress that had been made. The tension was compounded by uncertainty about the outside world. Patrons recognized that while the tavern offered a rare space of relative safety, beyond its doors lay unpredictable authorities, unforeseen obstacles, and the potential for betrayal. Each idea, each plan, was tempered by the reality that actions carried risk and consequences far beyond the immediate environment. This awareness added a quiet gravity to discussions, a measured weight that reinforced the need for patience, observation, and meticulous planning. The ordinary act of conversation had become a delicate balancing act, requiring both insight and restraint. Moments of reflection punctuated the tension. Patrons would pause, drink in hand, staring into the fire or gazing out the window at the darkened streets. These pauses were not empty, they allowed for assimilation, for careful consideration of both ideas and potential repercussions. The quiet was not silence but a space of thought, a temporal buffer in which the mind could process, weigh options, and anticipate outcomes. Even in these still moments, tension lingered, a quiet reminder of the stakes involved and the care required to navigate them. The elderly woman, ever perceptive, contributed to the tension through subtle interjections. A word of caution here, a reminder of history there, she guided reflection without imposing direction. Her quiet wisdom heightened awareness of consequences, ensuring that even the youngest or least experienced patrons internalized the gravity of their decisions. Through her presence, the tavern maintained a balance between inspiration and caution, nurturing ideas while tempering impulsive enthusiasm with measured reflection. Small alliances began to reveal their potential as tension sharpened focus. Patrons relied on one another's insights, tested reactions, and observed reliability under pressure. Trust, once abstract, was now a living, dynamic force, its maintenance critical to the alignment of thought and the eventual execution of plans. Each participant became increasingly aware that their actions, however small, contributed to a larger framework. The ordinary gestures of conversation, movement, and observation now carried the weight of strategic significance. Even the fire seemed to participate in the tension, its flickering light casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls and tables. The ordinary glow became a metaphor for the subtle energy circulating among patrons, unseen yet deeply felt. The gentle warmth comforted, yet reminded all present of the fragile balance between preparation and exposure. In this ordinary tavern, tension was not an obstacle but a catalyst, sharpening perception, fostering attentiveness, and preparing minds for the responsibilities that lay ahead. By the night's end, the tension had evolved into a steady, focused awareness. Patrons departed with deliberate movements, cautious glances, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding the stakes that had been explored. The tavern remained, unassuming yet profoundly significant, holding within its walls the echoes of careful thought, subtle alliances, and the gravity of potential action. Outside, the streets were silent, the town unaware of the invisible forces of preparation and tension that had been cultivated within its ordinary heart. In this ordinary yet extraordinary environment, tension was not merely anxiety. It was a tool, a shaping force, and a constant reminder of the seriousness of ideas once shared and nurtured. It refined focus, encouraged caution, and reinforced trust. The patrons, though appearing ordinary, had absorbed the lessons of patience, observation, and strategic awareness, preparing for a future where their careful deliberations could manifest into meaningful action. And as the last embers of the fire faded, one could almost sense that the quiet tension cultivated within the tavern was a vital precursor to the extraordinary events yet to unfold, a calm before a deliberate and transformative storm. After weeks of quiet reflection, strategy, and careful alliance building, the moment arrived, subtle, unassuming, yet brimming with significance. It was not an eruption of noise or chaos, it was a deliberate, measured step, the first tangible manifestation of all the thought and preparation that had quietly taken root within the tavern. Patrons gathered, their faces calm but attentive, aware that even the smallest gesture could carry consequence. The ordinary environment of the tavern now held extraordinary purpose, as minds aligned to translate strategy into action for the first time. The first action was careful and deliberate. A single message, composed thoughtfully, was sent through trusted hands, a discreet note that would reach sympathetic individuals beyond the immediate circle. Its contents were simple, yet powerful, a recognition of shared concern, a hint at potential collaboration, and an invitation to consider aligned action. The delivery was quiet, almost invisible, a reminder that revolution does not always announce itself with fanfare, but often begins in the most ordinary, almost imperceptible ways. The scholar, now deeply aware of the subtleties involved, oversaw the preparation of this message. Every word was weighed for clarity, implication, and discretion. The phrasing was chosen to invite reflection rather than provoke rash decisions, to encourage consideration rather than impose a directive. This careful calibration ensured that the first action would ripple outward with intention and precision, carrying the potential to ignite curiosity, alignment, and a sense of shared purpose without attracting undue attention. The soldier, experienced in both leadership and caution, guided the logistics of execution. He selected reliable couriers, identified secure paths, and considered contingencies for potential discovery. Even the smallest detail, a messenger's route, the timing of departure, the manner of concealment, was accounted for, reinforcing the careful balance between initiative and prudence. In this way, the first action was not only symbolic, but operationally sound, reflecting the deliberate and patient approach cultivated within the tavern. Alliances played a critical role in this initial step. Trusted individuals within the tavern, carefully assessed over weeks of interaction, were enlisted to participate in subtle coordination. Their familiarity with the strategy, their understanding of discretion, and their alignment of values ensured that the action would be coherent, measured, and effective. Each participant contributed uniquely, one assessed risk, another refined phrasing, another coordinated timing. In this way, the first action was a collaborative manifestation of preparation, a tangible result of the invisible network that had formed quietly but deliberately. The atmosphere within the tavern was calm yet charged. Patrons moved with a quiet purpose, aware of the significance of their roles while maintaining composure. Even ordinary gestures, the pouring of ale, the movement of a chair, the lighting of a lantern, were imbued with layered meaning. These actions facilitated coordination, created subtle signals, and maintained the illusion of routine, ensuring that the extraordinary nature of the first action remained concealed from the unobservant eye. Outside the tavern, the night remained ordinary. Streets were quiet, the town's inhabitants unaware of the invisible forces at work. Yet in this stillness, the first action began to take shape. Couriers moved discreetly, passing messages from hand to hand, each aware of the importance of their task and the delicate trust upon which it relied. The ripple effect of these early movements would extend slowly, imperceptibly, yet with deliberate reach, touching minds and hearts in a pattern that had been carefully considered by those who remained within the tavern's protective embrace. The act itself was simple, yet profound in its impact. A note delivered to a sympathetic artisan sparked discussion among previously disconnected individuals. A brief verbal hint, carefully phrased, inspired reflection in someone who had been silently observing for weeks. The first action demonstrated that even the smallest gestures, when executed with preparation and subtlety, could serve as catalysts for broader engagement. The ordinary world outside remained unchanged in appearance, yet beneath the surface, awareness and alignment began to grow. The tavern's patrons watched these developments with a quiet, focused intensity. Their role was both direct and indirect, ensuring that execution adhered to strategy, observing reactions, and preparing to support further steps if necessary. Each participant understood that the success of the first action depended not on spectacle or force, but on subtlety, coherence, and the careful cultivation of trust. The ordinary gestures within the tavern, the rearrangement of chairs, the passing of mugs, the murmured observation, continued to conceal the extraordinary purpose that had unfolded within its walls. As the night progressed, the results of the first action began to manifest. Messages reached attentive ears, prompting reflection, discussion, and cautious alignment. Individuals previously isolated in thought or concern began to recognize shared values, common grievances, and the potential for coordinated effort. The first action, though seemingly modest, had initiated a quiet chain reaction. Ideas seeded, awareness raised, and trust reinforced. Patrons in the tavern observed these effects with measured satisfaction, understanding that the smallest of steps often carries the greatest potential when executed with care. The first action also served as a test of the alliances that had been formed. Patrons monitored responses, gauged reliability, and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Successes reinforced confidence, while minor missteps provided lessons in discretion and communication. In this way, the first action was not only a step toward external engagement, but also an internal calibration of the network itself. Each observation, each reflection, contributed to a growing understanding of how the community could operate collectively without compromising the subtlety that had ensured its safety. The ordinary tavern, meanwhile, maintained its appearance of calm routine. Firelight flickered gently across worn tables, shadows danced slowly along the walls, and the soft murmur of conversation continued as though nothing remarkable had occurred. This duality, the ordinary exterior concealing extraordinary purpose, was central to the first action's success. Patrons understood that revolution, whether of thought or practice, often requires invisibility and patience, and that ordinary appearances are powerful allies in the quiet orchestration of change. By the early hours of the morning, the first action had completed its initial course. The patrons, exhausted yet quietly satisfied, reflected on the implications of what had been accomplished. What had begun as a simple idea in a modest tavern had now moved into the wider consciousness, initiating the slow, deliberate process by which awareness, alignment, and trust would eventually manifest into coordinated, meaningful action. The ordinary had become extraordinary, not through spectacle, but through preparation, subtlety, and the deliberate unfolding of intention. And as the last of the patrons rose to leave, the tavern seemed to sigh softly, the echoes of deliberate footsteps mingling with the fading warmth of the fire. Outside, the night remained calm, unaware of the intricate networks, careful planning, and first steps taken in quiet rebellion. Within the tavern, however, a quiet sense of accomplishment lingered, a recognition that the first action had succeeded not through force or proclamation, but through patience, insight, and the careful alignment of ordinary individuals toward a shared purpose. This first action, modest though it appeared, set in motion a process that would gather momentum, deepen alliances, and shape events in ways that could not yet be fully perceived. It demonstrated the power of preparation, the necessity of discretion, and the profound impact of even the smallest gestures when executed with clarity and intention. The ordinary tavern had once again proven its extraordinary potential, serving as the cradle for ideas, strategies, and the quiet unfolding of history itself. After the first action quietly unfolded, the energy within the tavern began to shift subtly, as if the air itself had become charged with potential. Patrons, once contemplative and cautious, now carried a quiet confidence, a shared understanding that their careful planning was beginning to produce tangible effects. Conversations flowed with renewed purpose, weaving together observations, reflections, and insights into a growing pattern of alignment. Each participant, ordinary in appearance, sensed that the initial steps had sparked something larger, a momentum that could not be seen directly but could be felt in the rhythm of voices, gestures, and attentive glances. The scholar, notebook in hand, meticulously recorded these emerging patterns, noting how messages had been received, who had responded, and what subtle changes were visible in the behaviors of others. Observing the effects of the first action provided invaluable data, allowing for refinement of future steps. The soldier, drawing upon his experience, emphasized patience and vigilance, understanding that momentum could be both an asset and a vulnerability. While excitement was natural, careful attention to timing, discretion, and strategic planning remained paramount. Together, they analyzed outcomes, learned from subtle reactions, and prepared to harness the growing energy with deliberate care. Alliances strengthened as momentum increased. Patrons who had been hesitant before now moved closer into alignment, their trust reinforced by the tangible success of the first action. Ordinary gestures, sharing a quiet word, exchanging subtle nods, or offering a thoughtful question, became markers of cohesion and mutual understanding. Each interaction, while simple on the surface, contributed to the strengthening of a complex network of relationships that extended beyond the tavern. The ordinary act of conversation had become the vehicle for extraordinary coordination, a testament to the careful cultivation of patience, trust, and insight. The merchant observed the subtle shifts with practical awareness. He noted which individuals had begun to take initiative, which connections had solidified, and which networks of influence were emerging. Through quiet coordination, he encouraged the extension of momentum beyond the tavern walls, ensuring that ideas would reach attentive minds while maintaining the discretion essential to success. Each small extension, an interaction with a sympathetic artisan, a careful inquiry to a local worker, a subtle suggestion passed along the street, added to the growing current, reinforcing the collective awareness that had been meticulously nurtured. Momentum was reinforced not only through action but through perception. Patrons began to recognize that their efforts were not isolated, that even modest steps could influence thought, alignment, and awareness beyond immediate observation. This recognition created a quiet, self-sustaining energy, as each individual saw the impact of their engagement and felt responsibility to contribute to the larger purpose. Ordinary routines, sitting by the fire, sharing a mug of ale, leaning in to listen, were imbued with intention, each moment offering the potential to strengthen connection, trust, and strategic awareness. The tavern itself seemed to respond to this growing momentum. Firelight danced across the walls with a gentle intensity, casting shadows that seemed to emphasize focus and attention. The ambient murmur of conversation became a rhythm, guiding reflection and facilitating the subtle transfer of ideas. Even the arrangement of tables and chairs, the placement of lanterns, and the movement of patrons contributed to a spatial harmony that reinforced the alignment of thought. Ordinary elements of the environment had become instruments in the orchestration of momentum, enhancing the capacity for collective awareness and deliberate action. Small victories, though invisible to the outside world, fueled the sense of growing momentum. A message successfully delivered to a sympathetic artisan resulted in quiet discussion. A subtle observation shared by a dockworker prompted reflection and alignment among peers. Each instance reinforced the effectiveness of strategy, discretion, and collaboration, providing the tavern's patrons with reassurance that their careful efforts were producing meaningful results. The ordinary acts of observation, reflection, and communication, when executed thoughtfully, became the pillars upon which momentum rested, guiding the unfolding of a more cohesive and capable network. As momentum increased, patrons became more adept at reading one another, interpreting gestures, expressions, and nuances of tone. The ordinary act of conversation evolved into a subtle choreography, with participants responding to cues, adjusting strategies, and reinforcing alignment without overt direction. These interactions strengthened not only trust but also the efficiency of communication, enabling ideas and strategies to circulate more quickly while maintaining the discretion necessary to avoid exposure. Momentum, in this sense, was both practical and psychological, reinforcing engagement and fostering confidence in collective capability. The scholar and soldier, observing the effects, recognized the need to balance enthusiasm with caution. Momentum, while valuable, could accelerate too quickly, drawing unwanted attention or encouraging premature action. They emphasized reflection, careful planning, and selective engagement, ensuring that energy was channeled constructively rather than dissipated through impulsive or uncoordinated behavior. Their guidance maintained equilibrium, allowing the growing momentum to strengthen the network without compromising the discretion and preparation that had been so carefully cultivated. Patrons contributed to the growing momentum in diverse ways. Some offered insight, drawing from knowledge of local systems, patterns, and relationships. Others provided practical support, ensuring that communications were discreet and effective. A few contributed emotional intelligence, fostering cohesion, empathy, and mutual understanding. Even those who remained silent played a critical role, reinforcing momentum through attentive presence, thoughtful observation, and subtle signals of engagement. In this way, ordinary individuals collectively sustained and amplified the quiet current of influence, gradually transforming awareness into potential readiness for more overt action. The ordinary, everyday aspects of tavern life continued to provide the perfect backdrop for this expansion of momentum. The casual pouring of drinks, the gentle clatter of utensils, and the soft murmur of conversation created a sense of normalcy that concealed the extraordinary purpose unfolding within. Patrons could refine ideas, align understanding, and test reactions without attracting attention, allowing momentum to grow in a controlled and deliberate manner. Ordinary routines became tools, reinforcing both the psychology and the mechanics of collective engagement. As the nights progressed, the energy of momentum began to extend beyond the tavern. Small alliances communicated subtly with sympathetic individuals in the surrounding streets, workshops, and homes. Awareness spread in quiet, almost imperceptible ways, gradually weaving a network of aligned thought that extended far beyond the tavern's walls. Each successful interaction reinforced the sense that careful preparation, patience, and subtle coordination could influence change without drawing immediate scrutiny. Momentum, once a faint current within the tavern, now began to pulse more broadly, linking ordinary people in a web of understanding, alignment, and potential action. By the end of each evening, the patrons left the tavern with a quiet sense of purpose. Their ordinary routines carried the invisible imprint of momentum, subtly influencing behavior, thought, and communication as they returned to their lives. The tavern remained behind, steady, ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in function, a hub of alignment, preparation, and carefully nurtured energy. Within its walls, the rhythm of growing momentum had been established, preparing the patrons for further steps that would gradually translate awareness, trust, and collaboration into the unfolding of deliberate, coordinated action. With the growing momentum established within the tavern, the energy of purpose began to extend beyond its ordinary walls, reaching into the surrounding streets, homes, and workshops in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The quiet coordination that had been carefully nurtured now began to manifest in small, visible effects, like ripples radiating from a stone cast into still water. Ordinary individuals, previously unaware of their shared understanding, began to recognize one another, nodding subtly in acknowledgement of shared awareness. Each connection, however slight, contributed to a widening current of aligned thought, as the spark that had been kindled within the tavern started to illuminate corners of the town that had once remained shadowed in isolation. The first outward signs were almost imperceptible. A sympathetic artisan spoke quietly to a neighbor, framing a concern as a reflection rather than a call to action. A young laborer, previously cautious, asked a tentative question about local practices, prompted by the subtle encouragement of a trusted companion. Even in these ordinary exchanges, the underlying current of alignment was evident, a recognition that their experiences were shared, their observations valid, and their potential for coordinated understanding growing. Each small interaction added fuel to a quiet fire, extending the influence of the tavern far beyond its doors. The scholar continued to document these developments, his notebook now filled with the intricate mapping of connections, responses, and reactions. He noted how the smallest gestures, an understanding glance, a carefully chosen word, or the timing of a quiet inquiry, had amplified reach and influence. The soldier, experienced in reading both strategy and human behavior, interpreted these signals with care, identifying which pathways were secure, which required caution, and which had the potential for broader impact. Together, they observed the widening spark with both satisfaction and measured foresight, knowing that even subtle shifts could have profound consequences over time. Alliances, carefully formed within the tavern, now began to act as conduits, linking previously disconnected individuals and groups. A single whispered insight could travel through multiple hands, each participant reinforcing discretion, alignment, and purpose. These alliances, tested and strengthened by previous experience, ensured that the widening spark maintained its coherence and integrity, even as it extended into spaces beyond the immediate control of the original circle. Ordinary people, unaware of the full scope of the network, began to participate naturally, guided by trust, shared understanding, and subtle reinforcement. The merchant played a crucial role in this phase, observing the flow of information, relationships, and influence with practical precision. He identified individuals whose participation could significantly extend reach, introduced them to discrete channels of communication, and ensured that the movement of ideas was both efficient and secure. Through careful observation and guidance, the spark that had been confined to the tavern now began to radiate outward with deliberate reach, touching corners of the town previously untouched by aligned thought. The ordinary routines of daily life, once separate and isolated, were now subtly linked through these emerging channels of communication. As the spark widened, the tavern's patrons became increasingly aware of the broader significance of their efforts. Each subtle act, whether an encouraging word, a carefully framed question, or the timing of a note, was recognized as contributing to a larger, almost invisible framework. The ordinary environment of the town, with its familiar streets, homes, and workplaces, became a stage for subtle influence, its inhabitants unwitting participants in a quiet expansion of awareness. The spark, initially kindled in a modest, unassuming tavern, now began to illuminate spaces far beyond its walls, highlighting connections and shared understanding that had previously remained latent. Small, deliberate acts of coordination reinforced the widening spark. Patrons and their allies practiced careful observation, measuring reactions, assessing understanding, and adjusting communication accordingly. Messages were crafted with precision, gestures aligned with intention, and timing coordinated to maximize impact while minimizing risk. Even minor interventions, suggesting a reflection on a shared experience, highlighting a common grievance, or posing a gentle question, served to extend reach, nurture trust, and create alignment across increasingly dispersed networks. The ordinary routines of daily life became vehicles for subtle influence, enabling the spark to spread while maintaining discretion and coherence. The psychological impact of this widening spark was profound. Individuals who had previously felt isolated or powerless began to perceive themselves as part of a broader pattern of thought and awareness. Their observations gained significance, their insights were validated, and their potential for coordinated engagement became evident. The ordinary act of participation, whether through conversation, reflection, or small gestures, now carried amplified meaning, reinforcing both individual confidence and collective cohesion. The spark, once confined to private understanding, now radiated as a shared awareness, creating a quiet yet powerful sense of purpose across multiple layers of the community. Even the ordinary spaces of the town contributed to the widening of the spark. Markets, workshops, streets, and homes became nodes of subtle connection, where ordinary interactions could carry extraordinary influence. A question posed in a marketplace, framed innocuously as curiosity, could spark reflection and alignment. A quiet remark exchanged over a shared task might reinforce trust and understanding. In this way, the ordinary fabric of daily life became intertwined with the deliberate expansion of awareness, each interaction acting as a small conduit for alignment, cohesion, and preparation. As the spark continued to spread, the tavern remained a central hub of observation, reflection, and guidance. Patrons returned nightly, assessing the effects of outward movements, refining strategies, and nurturing alliances. The firelight, flickering steadily across worn tables, served as both a literal and symbolic reminder of the continuity of effort. Within its ordinary walls, extraordinary coordination continued to evolve, ensuring that the widening spark retained its clarity, direction, and integrity even as it touched more distant and diverse participants. The widening spark also generated subtle challenges, testing the resilience and discretion of those involved. Not every interaction was perfectly aligned, not every response reinforced cohesion. Yet each minor misstep provided lessons, refining communication, strengthening trust, and reinforcing the importance of patience and vigilance. Patrons learned to navigate these challenges with quiet sophistication, understanding that the growth of the spark required both adaptability and subtlety, and that its power depended on the careful integration of lessons learned from observation and experience. Small, tangible outcomes of the widening spark further reinforced momentum. Individuals who had been encouraged to reflect on shared experiences began to initiate conversations, quietly extending influence within their own circles. Ideas, once confined to private reflection, began to circulate more widely, creating a slow yet perceptible movement of thought that linked ordinary lives into a subtle but coherent pattern of awareness. The ordinary town, unaware of the orchestration unfolding around them, had begun to host the invisible threads of understanding that would later form the backbone of coordinated action. By the end of each night, the widening spark had extended into ever more subtle and dispersed networks. Patrons departed the tavern with quiet satisfaction, aware that their efforts were producing measurable, though largely invisible, effects. Outside, the streets were calm, homes were quiet, and the town appeared ordinary. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, awareness, trust, and alignment had been growing steadily, guided by the careful orchestration, observation, and subtle influence of those who had first kindled the spark. The spark that began in whispers within an ordinary tavern had now become a network of potential, a web of interconnected understanding that spanned the town. It was fueled by preparation, patience, subtle communication, and trust. Ordinary individuals, guided by careful strategy and aligned intention, had become carriers of influence, each small action reinforcing cohesion, expanding reach, and nurturing the quiet anticipation of future developments. Within the ordinary, a foundation for extraordinary transformation had been laid, preparing the town for events that, though invisible now, would soon ripple through every corner of its social fabric. As the widening spark quietly coursed through the town, a subtle but unmistakable shift began to take shape, the turning point. It was not marked by sudden noise or dramatic upheaval, but by a perceptible realignment of awareness, a moment when careful preparation, patient observation, and deliberate action converged into a pivotal moment of potential. Patrons of the tavern, attuned to both the ordinary rhythms of their environment and the extraordinary patterns they had cultivated, sensed that the cumulative effects of weeks of strategy and coordination were beginning to manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored. The scholar, notebook open, observed with a mix of satisfaction and vigilance. Connections that had seemed tentative now revealed themselves as robust pathways, capable of sustaining influence and reinforcing alignment across multiple circles. Messages that had been delivered discreetly, gestures exchanged with subtlety, and conversations framed with care now carried tangible weight. Individuals who had previously been isolated in thought or cautious in engagement began to take independent steps, extending the spark with confidence grounded in trust and understanding. The ordinary tavern had nurtured extraordinary readiness, and now that readiness was approaching its first visible inflection point. The soldier, experienced in both human behavior and the art of timing, interpreted these signals as the critical juncture. He recognized that momentum, when guided prudently, could transform into decisive influence. Yet he also understood that miscalculation at this stage could undermine months of preparation. The turning point required not boldness for its own sake, but measured courage, precise timing, and careful observation. Actions had to be deliberate, subtle, and aligned, ensuring that the emerging potential would be harnessed rather than dissipated. In this delicate balance, strategy met opportunity, and ordinary individuals were poised to take their first steps into extraordinary effect. Alliances, painstakingly formed over weeks of trust-building and quiet collaboration, became the conduits through which the turning point unfolded. Participants moved with intentionality, guided by prior interactions, shared understanding, and the mutual reinforcement of confidence. Subtle signals, an understanding glance, a gentle nod, a carefully timed comment, coordinated action without overt direction. The ordinary gestures of everyday life, observed in the flicker of lantern light or the quiet movements of patrons, now held layered meaning, guiding the network toward a pivotal convergence. These alliances, tested and strengthened through patient observation, ensured that the turning point would not fracture but instead amplify the cumulative energy carefully cultivated within the tavern. The merchant, ever attuned to practical realities, facilitated the extension of this turning point beyond the tavern's immediate sphere. He coordinated trusted couriers, monitored the reach of communications, and ensured that the broader network responded with alignment rather than confusion. Through subtle interventions, discreet guidance, quietly placed hints, and strategic introductions, he reinforced the cohesion of the expanding web of influence. Ordinary interactions in marketplaces, workshops, and homes now carried the echoes of careful strategy, allowing the spark to converge at a moment of readiness that would become the turning point of the unfolding story. The turning point was reinforced by observation, reflection, and selective action. Patrons watched for reactions, interpreted signals, and adjusted their movements with precision. A gesture unnoticed by outsiders, a hand resting lightly on a shoulder, a question posed with just the right tone, could trigger alignment, foster trust, and strengthen the network. The ordinary rhythms of tavern life became instruments of subtle coordination, supporting a convergence of intent that had been nurtured over weeks. The turning point was not imposed but emerged organically, a result of the careful orchestration, patience, and discretion that had defined every step of preparation. Tension, once a quiet undercurrent, now sharpened the focus of patrons. They understood that this moment carried consequences, that the culmination of preparation would influence both immediate and future developments. Conversations, gestures, and even silences were imbued with awareness of potential risk and reward. Ordinary interactions were now charged with significance, each participant mindful that subtle missteps could ripple through the network. Yet this tension was productive, not paralyzing, guiding the alignment of thought, action, and observation in a way that strengthened cohesion and enhanced the effectiveness of the emerging turning point. The turning point also revealed the power of small, deliberate actions. A note delivered to a sympathetic artisan prompted quiet reflection and discussion, extending awareness beyond the immediate circle. A carefully framed conversation in a marketplace inspired consideration of shared values and potential collaboration. Even minor observations exchanged between neighbors began to reinforce trust and alignment. Each of these small interventions, seemingly ordinary in isolation, converged to create a critical mass of understanding and preparedness. The turning point, while subtle in outward appearance, was powerful in its ability to concentrate the energy, momentum, and alignment cultivated within the tavern into a coherent wave of influence. The scholar and soldier continued to guide observation, ensuring that the turning point was understood and leveraged without compromising discretion. They monitored patterns, identified gaps, and adjusted recommendations with care. Patrons responded with quiet attentiveness, reinforcing the collective understanding and ensuring that alignment was maintained across multiple networks. Ordinary gestures, moving a chair, adjusting the firelight, passing a quiet comment, became subtle tools of coordination, enhancing the coherence of the turning point and reinforcing the integrity of the emerging framework of influence. As the night deepened, the first visible effects of the turning point began to manifest. Individuals previously hesitant to engage now acted with confidence, extending ideas, sharing observations, and participating in subtle coordination beyond the tavern's immediate environment. The ordinary world outside remained unaware, yet the town's rhythms were subtly influenced by the quiet alignment of thought, trust, and intention that had emerged from weeks of preparation. Patrons observed these effects with calm satisfaction, recognizing that the turning point had successfully converted potential into measurable action without overt spectacle or risk. Even the most ordinary aspects of the tavern contributed to this pivotal moment. Firelight, lanterns, the arrangement of tables, and the soft murmur of conversation all facilitated the subtle orchestration of actions, signals, and observations. These everyday elements, often overlooked, became instruments in the manifestation of influence, ensuring that coordination remained seamless and effective. The turning point, while emerging from careful planning and patient preparation, relied upon the ordinary environment as both shield and amplifier, enabling extraordinary potential to unfold quietly but decisively.